A single photograph could be a bridge to a past you thought was buried forever. But sometimes, that bridge led somewhere darker than anyone imagined. It led to a truth so deliberately hidden, so carefully erased from official records, that uncovering it would cost everything and save everything. This is the story of what happens when that bridge finally gets built. The scent of burnt coffee and artificial vanilla syrup hung heavy in the air of Morrison's Diner on 5th Street in Portland, Oregon. It was a smell that had become so familiar to Madison Torres that she no longer noticed it the way other people did. It had seeped into her uniform, her hair, the very fabric of her dreams. At 20 years old, she had been working this shift for 6 years. 6 years since her mother's medical diagnosis had transformed from manageable crisis into an endless financial hemorrhage. Madison moved through the diner with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to multitask survival. Coffee pot in one hand, order pad in the other. Her mind running calculations that never quite added up. Tips stretched thin across next week's medication costs. Hours multiplied into double shifts. Every spare moment calculated and allocated before it even existed. Her mother, Elena, had been diagnosed with stage 3 diabetes complications 3 years ago, and the treatments had drained their savings like water through a broken dam. The diner job wasn't enough anymore. It hadn't been enough for 2 years, but it was all Madison had. What Madison didn't know was that someone had been watching her handwriting. 200 miles away in Seattle, Washington, a different kind of survival was taking place. Not the survival of making rent or choosing between medication and groceries, but the survival of obsession. Gregory Ashford III lived in a penthouse study that overlooked the city like a throne room overlooks a kingdom. The mahogany shelves held leather-bound journals, some inherited, some collected, all meticulously organized. The silence in that room was the silence of inherited wealth, which was to say it was the silence of people who no longer had to listen to anything they didn't want to hear. Gregory's world had contracted into a single point 30 years ago. A missing daughter. A 3-day-old infant taken from Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles under circumstances that official reports called tragic clerical error. Gregory had learned to live with this version of events the way powerful men learn to live with inevitable losses, with controlled rage and the kind of quiet resignation that only money can buy. But he had never stopped looking. This isn't a redemption story. This isn't a tale where good people get rewarded and bad people face consequences. This is the story of how a forgotten photograph exposed 3 decades of institutional lies, shattered a billionaire's certainty, and revealed that sometimes the person you're searching for has been right in front of you all along, serving you coffee at a Portland diner, where the tips barely cover tomorrow's bills. Gregory Ashford had built an empire on the assumption that wealth could solve any problem. He was about to learn that some problems weren't waiting to be solved. They were waiting to be discovered. And some truths didn't care how much money you had. This isn't a fairy tale. There's no magic wand here, no miraculous intervention, no destiny that bends toward justice. What there is, 3 decades of institutional negligence, deliberate cover-ups, a man wealthy enough to demand answers finally learning that money can't buy back lost time, and a waitress in Portland who had no idea that her handwriting was about to change everything. If you believe in the power of truth over lies, if you believe that justice matters more than convenience, subscribe now. This story will test everything you think you know about who deserves to be found and who has the right to hide. The leather-bound journal sat on Gregory Ashford's desk like a relic. Burgundy leather, worn at the edges from 30 years of handling. The kind of wear that came from obsessive touching, from pages opened and closed 1,000 times in search of answers that never materialized. Gold leaf initials MA were embossed in the upper right corner, and beneath them, the leather had faded to a lighter shade, as if the initials themselves were slowly being erased by time and fingerprints. The pages inside were yellowed and brittle, filled with Margaret's handwriting, precise, controlled, distinctive in the way that only obsessive documentation could be. Every letter formed with intention, every margin filled with theories, every observation written as if the act of writing itself could resurrect the past or rewrite it into something less unbearable. A hospital bracelet served as a bookmark, pink plastic, faded from decades of storage, with the name Baby Girl Ashford printed across it in fading ink. That bracelet represented 3 days of Margaret's life as a mother. 3 days before everything went dark. The back cover bore a coffee stain that Gregory had refused to have cleaned. It was the last physical remnant of Margaret herself. The last time her coffee cup had touched this journal. The last moment before the stroke that would eventually take her life. Gregory left it there deliberately, a wound he chose not to heal. This journal was Margaret's refusal to accept the official narrative. It was her rebellion against the doctors who said the baby had been transferred, against the hospital administrators who sealed the records, against the investigators who eventually told her to stop looking, that some doors were best left closed. Margaret had documented everything. Nurse handwriting samples collected from hospital records, timeline inconsistencies that contradicted official statements, details about the day their daughter vanished that no official report mentioned. After Margaret died, Gregory discovered that her theories were more thorough than any investigator's report had ever been. The journal became more than documentation. It became his obsession, his only link to the daughter he never knew and the wife he had lost too soon. At 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, Gregory sat in his study scrolling through social media. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was just doing what he had done every night for the past 30 years, looking, searching random hashtags, following obscure trends, examining the backgrounds of viral videos for something, anything that might connect to his lost daughter. The TikTok video was titled Awkward Diner Moments. It was the kind of content that accumulated millions of views without meaning anything. But in the background of one clip, visible for less than 2 seconds, was a waitress taking an order. The angle is poor. The resolution is grainy. The lighting made it difficult to see clearly. But the handwriting on her order pad was impossible to miss. Gregory enlarged the image. He zoomed in on the letters. His breath stopped somewhere in his chest. The G looped in that distinctive way, not the standard formation that writing teachers instructed, but a peculiar curl that Margaret had documented obsessively in her journal. The T was crossed in an unusual manner, starting from below the horizontal line and crossing upward. Not similar to Margaret's documented handwriting, not reminiscent of it, identical. His hands began trembling. For 30 years, investigators had told him there was nothing to find. For 30 years, he had accepted that his daughter was gone, that the official story of tragic clerical error was the closest he would ever get to truth. For 30 years, he had learned to live with absence. But this handwriting didn't lie. This handwriting was a voice from the past, speaking in letters and loops that couldn't be coincidence. Gregory held his phone next to Margaret's journal, comparing the enlarged image to the handwriting samples his late wife had collected. The formations were identical. The patterns were unmistakable. After 3 decades of searching, the answer had appeared in the background of a viral video, in a diner he had never visited, in the handwriting of a waitress whose name he didn't yet know. He booked a flight to Portland that night. Gregory arrived at Morrison's Diner on Thursday morning. The place smelled exactly as he expected. Burnt coffee and artificial syrup, the particular scent of institutional survival. He ordered coffee at the counter and waited, watching the service staff move through their routines with a kind of efficiency that came from years of repetition. When Madison brought his check, Gregory stopped her. His voice was quiet, but there was something in its intensity that made nearby customers pause in their conversations. "Excuse me, that handwriting on your order pad. May I ask where you learned to write like that?" Madison's confusion was immediate and visible. "What? I don't understand what you mean." "The specific way you form your letters," Gregory continued. "It's distinctive, unusual. I've seen it before." Madison shifted her weight, preparing to leave. This man was strange. This man was the kind of customer who made servers uncomfortable. "My late wife wrote exactly like that," Gregory said. "The same formations, the same patterns. It's impossible." "Sir, I think you should." Madison's hand moved toward her apron pocket, ready to signal for her manager. "How old are you?" Gregory asked. That's personal." 28. Madison's face drained of color. She didn't answer. Gregory leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on her face. "You have a scar above your left eyebrow." How did you get it? Madison's grip on the coffee pot loosened. The ceramic vessel slipped from her fingers and shattered against the tile floor. The sound was loud in the suddenly quiet diner. Other customers turned to stare. Her manager emerged from the kitchen, ready to intervene. Who are you? Madison's voice was barely above a whisper. How do you know that? Gregory stood slowly. His posture carried the kind of authority that came from decades of boardroom meetings and inherited certainty. Because I've been looking for you for 30 years. And I think you might be my daughter. The diner seemed to hold its breath. Madison stood frozen, coffee dripping from the broken pot onto her apron. Around them, other customers watched the scene unfold with a morbid fascination that strangers reserve for witnessing someone else's life rupture. Madison's manager arrived, his face flushed with protective anger. Sir, you need to leave. Now, before I call the police. But Madison raised her hand. Her eyes never left Gregory's face. Wait, she whispered. Wait. Gregory's lawyer arrived at Morrison's diner within 2 hours. The man was polished, efficient, and carried a leather briefcase containing documents that had been sealed for 30 years. Madison's manager had reluctantly agreed to let Gregory stay in a back booth while Madison took her break. The other waitresses whispered and stared. Regular customers sensed something significant happening, though they couldn't articulate what it was. Gregory spread the documents across the table like a prosecutor presenting evidence at trial. Margaret's journal lay open, its pages facing Madison. Birth records from Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Hospital documentation marked with redactions so thorough that entire paragraphs disappeared into black ink. A TikTok screenshot with the timestamp highlighted. I have handwriting analysis, Gregory said, his voice steady and clinical. I have birth records. I have hospital documentation. I have DNA evidence waiting to be verified if you consent to testing. He stated it all as fact, not theory. His certainty was terrifying to Madison because she possessed no certainty to match it. Her entire life, her mother Elena had been evasive about her early childhood. Adoption complications, Elena would say when Madison asked questions. Painful to discuss. Those 4 words had functioned as a door that Madison had learned not to knock on. Madison's hands trembled as she looked at the documents. She recognized nothing and everything simultaneously. I need to talk to my mother. Your mother can confirm what I'm telling you, Gregory said, or she can continue to lie. Either way, the truth is in these documents. Madison's manager appeared at the booth's edge. Sir, I'm going to need you to either order something or leave. Gregory ordered coffee without looking up from his briefcase. His lawyer closed the documents with deliberate slowness. That evening, Madison confronted her mother. Elena's hands shook as she prepared dinner that neither of them would eat. Is it true? Madison asked. Am I adopted? Elena's silence was confirmation enough. Are you a liar or a thief? Madison's voice was hollow. The words had come from somewhere deep, from a place she didn't recognize as her own. Did you lie about who I am, or did you steal me? Elena's face crumbled. She reached for Madison, but her daughter stepped back. I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Now, Elena sat down at the kitchen table, and the truth spilled out like something that had been rotting inside her for decades, waiting to finally be released. She told Madison about the hospital, about the woman with money, about the decision that had seemed merciful at the time and had become a burden with every passing year. Madison listened without speaking. When her mother finished, Madison left the apartment without saying goodbye. The next morning, Gregory was standing outside Morrison's diner when Madison arrived for her shift. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, one black, one with cream and sugar. He had somehow known how she took it, or perhaps he was simply guessing. Madison took the coffee with cream and sugar. They sat in Gregory's rental car in the parking lot, and Gregory presented everything methodically. The evidence wasn't circumstantial. It was overwhelming. Margaret's journal contained handwriting samples from nurses documented at Cedars-Sinai. The formations matched Margaret's subsequent notes perfectly. The timeline was airtight. The DNA test results were pending, but the documentation alone was sufficient. Your mother is either a liar or a thief, Gregory said, his voice devoid of judgment but heavy with certainty. There's no third option here. Madison flinched. She had been defending Elena for years, caring for her through medical crises, sacrificing her own future, protecting her in ways that should have been unnecessary. This accusation didn't just attack Elena. It attacked Madison's entire identity, her entire understanding of who she was and where she had come from. But Gregory continued, and his words cut deeper with each sentence. "I don't need your forgiveness or your acceptance," he said. "I need you to understand that you have rights. You have a family. You have a history that extends beyond the woman who raised you, as much as you might love her." He placed a business card and a check on the console between them. $5,000. Gregory's expression didn't change as he looked at the check, at the way Madison's jaw tightened, at the way she seemed to shrink into herself. "For your troubles," he said with the practiced dismissal of someone who had used money to solve problems his entire life. "Consider it a gesture of good faith." He left the car and walked back to his hotel with the kind of authority that made people step aside without thinking, without question. Madison sat in the rental car, holding the check like it was a bomb counting down to detonation. That evening, Madison researched Gregory Ashford III on her laptop. She found news articles from 30 years ago. A missing baby from Los Angeles, a billionaire's grief sealed records, lawsuits that had been settled under confidentiality agreements. She found Margaret Ashford's obituary, which mentioned a daughter who was taken too young and whose memory inspired a lifetime of searching. The connection was undeniable. The truth was terrifying. Madison called the number on Gregory's business card. When he answered, her voice trembled with something between rage and desperation. "If you're telling the truth," she said, "prove it. Give me concrete proof, not theories, not handwriting analysis, something undeniable." "And if I do?" Gregory's voice was cautious, as if he was afraid this moment might disappear if he moved too quickly. "Then I need to know why my mother never told me," Madison whispered. "And you need to know why your daughter has been alive this entire time, and you missed it." The line went silent except for the sound of breathing. Two strangers connected by blood and separated by 30 years of institutional lies. "I'll have the DNA results by tomorrow," Gregory finally said. "Will you be home?" Madison gave him her address and hung up without saying goodbye. She sat in the darkness of her small apartment, surrounded by medical bills and the weight of a life that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Subscribe now if you want to know what happened when those DNA results arrived. This is where the truth stops being theory and becomes undeniable. Madison confronted her mother that night. Elena's hands shook as she prepared dinner that neither of them would eat. The kitchen was small, cramped, filled with the weight of accumulated secrets. Madison sat at the table and waited. Elena moved through the space like a ghost, opening cabinets, closing them, pulling out ingredients she ultimately wouldn't use. "Tell me everything," Madison said. Her voice was hollow, carved out of a day that had fundamentally broken her understanding of who she was. Elena sat down slowly, as if her body had suddenly become foreign to her. She had been carrying this truth like a stone in her chest for 28 years. Now finally it was time to set it down. "I wasn't the woman who took you," Elena began. "I was the nurse who helped facilitate the transfer." In 1996, Elena had been working the night shift at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. She was a good nurse, compassionate, careful, by the book in all the ways that mattered. But she was also desperate in ways that only grief could create. Her own daughter had died 6 months earlier from a congenital heart defect that should have been caught during prenatal screening. The medical system had failed her. The hospitals had failed her. The grief had hollowed her out completely, leaving behind a woman who moved through life like something pretending to be human. A woman had come to her. This woman had money, the kind of money that made things happen in hospitals where people weren't asking too many questions. Her name was Charlotte Vance. She said she wanted a child, Elena explained, her voice barely above a whisper. She said the Ashford's baby had been born with complications that the family couldn't handle the publicity of revealing. She said there were quiet discussions happening, legal settlements being drawn up, sealed records being prepared. Elena's hands trembled as she continued. Charlotte had approached her systematically, carefully, the way someone approaches a person they know is broken and therefore malleable. Charlotte had offered Elena money to facilitate a transfer, to adjust records, to make sure certain documents disappeared into the black spaces where institutional negligence hid. Elena, broken and grieving, had said yes. The Ashford baby Madison had been given to Charlotte, who raised her in San Francisco for the first 3 years of her life. Madison had memories from that time. She had always thought they were dreams. A yellow nursery with mobile stars hanging overhead. A woman who sang in French while changing diapers. Soft hands and perfume that smelled like jasmine. Then the accident happened. Charlotte had suffered a stroke when Madison was 3 years old. She died 6 weeks later in a hospital that Madison no longer remembered, but whose presence lingered like a ghost in her consciousness. Madison had been taken into state custody. She had been shuffled through the system for 18 months, moved from one foster home to another, treated as a problem to be solved rather than a child to be loved. During those 18 months, Elena had been racked with guilt and remorse so intense that it had become a physical presence in her life. She had done what she'd promised never to do. She had pulled every string she had, called in every favor, manipulated every bureaucratic process to adopt Madison legally. Elena had raised Madison as her own, never telling her the truth. She had been terrified that the Ashfords would come looking. She had been terrified of the legal consequences of what she'd done. Most of all, she had been terrified of losing the only child she had left, the child who had become her reason for continuing to exist after her own daughter's death. "I'm sorry," Elena sobbed. The words came out broken and raw. "I've been sorry every single day for 28 years. Madison watched her mother fall apart across the kitchen table. Elena's shoulders shook with tears that had been trapped for decades. "I saved you because I loved you," Elena continued. "I lied because I was afraid of losing you. I know that doesn't excuse anything. I know that I stole your identity. I know that I kept you from your real family. But Madison, I need you to understand that I loved you every single moment of every single day." Madison moved around the table and held her mother. They cried together, not for the truth that had been revealed, but for the time that had been lost, for the identity that had been stolen from both of them, for the lives they might have lived if the world had worked differently. In the days that followed, Madison realized something that cut deeper than any DNA test could confirm. Her entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. The medical crisis with her mother's diabetes wasn't just a personal struggle. It was evidence of resources that rightfully belonged to Madison's biological inheritance. The financial struggle, the years of survival, the sacrifice of her own potential. All of it might have been unnecessary if she'd known who she really was. But more than that realization came another one, darker and more systemic. Somewhere out there, a man had spent 30 years thinking his daughter was dead. A man who had the resources to help, to change her life, to provide the stability she had never known. But he couldn't, because she had been made invisible to him. The injustice wasn't just personal. It was systemic. It was about how the wealthy could erase people, shuffle lives like cards, and walk away while others suffered the consequences. It was about how institutions failed to protect the vulnerable. It was about how money could buy silence, and how power could purchase the disappearance of inconvenient truths. Elena told Madison stories about Charlotte that Madison had almost forgotten, about the woman who had raised her for 3 years and then simply vanished from her life. Charlotte had been kind in the way that privilege allowed her to be kind, generous with money but absent with herself. She had sung in French because she had studied in Paris before marriage. She had loved Madison in her own distant way, the way someone loves a possession they've always wanted. "You were so loved," Elena whispered to her daughter. "By all of us, by Charlotte, by me, by people you'll never even know about." Madison understood then that this wasn't a simple story of rescue and reunion. It wasn't a fairy tale where everything would be resolved and everyone would live happily. This was a story of institutional negligence, of hospitals that allowed records to be altered, of legal systems that sealed away the truth, of governments that chose convenience over justice. This was a story of wealth used as a tool of deception, of a woman desperate enough to commit fraud in order to have a child, of a nurse so broken by grief that she participated in the erasure of another human being. of love expressed through lies, of sacrifice entangled with betrayal, of family built on foundations that couldn't support the weight of truth. Madison held her mother's hand and felt the tremor in her fingers. The same tremor that had become familiar from years of watching her mother's blood sugar spike and crash, from years of managing medical crises that shouldn't have been their burden to carry. "I'm not angry at you," Madison finally said. "I'm angry at everyone who let this happen. At the hospital, at the Ashfords, at the system that made it possible." Elena squeezed her daughter's hand. "Then we'll be angry together, and we'll make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Gregory hired a forensic handwriting analyst within days. The analyst was meticulous, professional, and conducted her analysis with a kind of scientific precision that left no room for doubt. She compared Madison's handwriting to Margaret's documented samples, side by side. She photographed both, enlarged them, projected them on screens for comparison. The formation was identical. The distinctive G-loop appeared in both samples. The unusual crossing of the T replicated perfectly. The spacing between letters matched. The pressure applied to the pen created identical indentations. The analyst's conclusion was definitive. 99.7% certainty that the handwriting samples came from the same hand. Professional photographs were taken of both leather journals, Margaret's burgundy-covered obsession and the simpler notebooks Madison had filled over the years. The visual documentation was exhaustive. Video evidence from the TikTok was professionally analyzed frame by frame, the timestamp verified, the authenticity confirmed. Every piece of visual evidence pointed toward one undeniable truth. Madison Ashford had been alive for 30 years while her family believed she was dead. Gregory's private investigators dug into public records from 1996 with the kind of thoroughness that money could buy. They located hospital records from Cedars-Sinai, heavily redacted, but accessible with legal pressure and the right connections. They discovered Charlotte Vance's death certificate, filed in San Francisco in 1999. They located newspaper archives about the missing Ashford baby from 30 years ago. Old stories that had faded from public memory but existed in digital archives and microfilm. The adoption records were heavily redacted, entire sections blacked out by institutional caution. But with legal leverage and court orders, the investigators gradually accessed the underlying documentation. The puzzle pieces began to fit together. The timeline crystallized. By 1996, a baby named Madison had been taken from Cedars-Sinai. By 1999, Charlotte Vance had died in San Francisco. By 2000, Elena had adopted a child through the state system. It wasn't coincidence. It was documented institutional failure. A forensic genealogist was brought into the investigation. She worked methodically to reconstruct family trees. Margaret's family, Gregory's family, Charlotte's family. She cross-referenced birth certificates, death certificates, and marriage records. She tracked the flow of money through generations, identified inheritance patterns, documented the structure of the Ashford family business. A medical expert analyzed the vague references to complications mentioned in sealed records. The expert reviewed Margaret's journal entries and noted that the complications mentioned seemed inconsistent with standard medical protocols. Nothing about the situation made medical sense. Everything about it made business sense. A legal historian examined the precedent of sealed adoption records and privacy laws. She documented how institutions have been authorized, both by law and by custom, to hide information that served the interests of the powerful. She testified that the sealing of Madison's records wasn't standard procedure. It was evidence of deliberate institutional protection of someone's interests. Each expert provided testimony. Each expert corroborated the narrative. Each expert helped transform Gregory's obsession from theory into documented fact. But then Gregory's private investigators uncovered something darker. Charlotte Vance had been under surveillance. Not subtle surveillance, but documented, systematic observation. Private investigators' reports from 30 years ago surfaced. Reports that had been filed and forgotten in dusty archives. Someone had been watching Charlotte and Madison. Someone had been documenting their lives. The reports were clinical, detached. Descriptions of Charlotte's daily routine, photographs of Madison at various ages, financial assessments of Charlotte's assets. The implication was chilling. Charlotte's existence had been monitored, tracked, managed by someone with both resources and motivation. Gregory recognized the handwriting on these surveillance reports. His Aunt Catherine. She had been documenting Charlotte's life in real time, maintaining a paper trail of observations that suggested something far more sinister than a simple adoption arrangement. Margaret's journal contained references that Gregory had previously overlooked. There were mentions of a woman in Switzerland, a woman connected to the Ashford family business. Gregory's investigators tracked this lead and discovered connections between Catherine Ashford and international financial networks. They found international financial records showing payments made 3 decades ago, payments labeled simply as private matter and family business. The Swiss connection led to shell corporations. The shell corporations led to accounts that had been deliberately obscured through layers of legal structures designed to hide their true ownership. Catherine Ashford had her fingers in more than just family affairs. She had access to money that Gregory hadn't known existed. In Margaret's journal, there was a peculiar entry from 1996, the year Madison disappeared. Margaret had written Charlotte's maiden name as Vance crossed it out, and rewritten it as Ashford multiple times on the same page. The crosses outs suggested Margaret had been investigating something, questioning something, suspecting something about Charlotte's true identity. The journal entries revealed that Margaret suspected Charlotte wasn't truly the Ashford's biological sister. Margaret theorized that Charlotte was an adopted family member whose identity had been deliberately obscured in official records. Margaret had been asking questions about Charlotte's background, about why there was so little documented history, about why certain family records went missing. Margaret had been searching for answers about the family structure, even as her infant daughter was being taken from her. The DNA test results arrived on a Friday afternoon. Madison's DNA was compared to Gregory's. Perfect biological match. Margaret's archived samples were compared to Madison's. Undeniable genetic connection. Charlotte's medical records were located and compared to Madison's genetic profile. The genetic markers were unmistakable. Madison was biologically the child of Gregory and Margaret Ashford. The science was beyond question. The truth was documented in DNA that couldn't lie, that couldn't be altered, that couldn't be denied. Gregory and Madison met formally in his lawyer's office on the morning the DNA results were confirmed. The space was sterile, professional, designed to contain important conversations without allowing emotion to escape. Both were terrified. Both were hopeful. Both were grieving versions of themselves that no longer existed. "I don't know what I'm doing here," Gregory admitted. His usual certainty had fractured. "I've waited 30 years for this conversation, and I'm completely unprepared. My mom raised me," Madison said quietly. "She sacrificed everything for me. That's real, no matter what else is true." Gregory nodded. "I'm not here to take her place. I'm here because you deserve to know the truth, and because I need to know you." They formed an agreement in that sterile office. Madison would undergo complete legal recognition as Madison Ashford, the biological daughter of Gregory and Margaret. Elena would be honored as her legal mother. The family structure would be reconstituted, not to erase the past, but to acknowledge what was always true beneath the lies. Gregory offered resources immediately: medical care for Elena, financial stability for Madison, legal representation for the investigation that was about to unfold. He offered access to the Ashford family archives, to the resources that should have been hers from birth. "Our quest for truth is now inextricably linked," Gregory told her. "Whatever we discover next, we discover together." Madison took his hand, and in that gesture a new family was born, not without damage, not without scars, but real nonetheless. As investigators dug deeper into the financial records, they discovered that Charlotte Vance wasn't acting alone. Catherine Ashford, Gregory's aunt and the family's business manager, had orchestrated the entire arrangement. The evidence emerged slowly, documented in financial transactions and surveillance reports. Catherine had been the architect. Charlotte had merely been the instrument. Catherine presented herself to Gregory as helpful. She provided family documents with practiced sympathy. She shared old photographs of Charlotte from decades past, accompanied by nostalgic memories. She seemed sympathetic to his search for the truth. She appeared supportive of his reunion with Madison. But Gregory's investigators began noticing patterns that made them uncomfortable. Every crucial document Catherine provided was slightly too convenient. Every memory she shared was perfectly positioned to support a particular narrative that subtly redirected the investigation. Every piece of evidence she helped recover guided Gregory's attention away from certain questions while illuminating others. Catherine was controlling the narrative. Catherine was managing the investigation. Then the forensic genealogist made a discovery that reframed everything. Catherine Ashford wasn't Gregory's aunt. She was his sister, his biological sister. She was a biological sister of Gregory's father, placed for adoption as an infant decades ago. The genealogist uncovered adoption records that had been deliberately obscured in the family's official history. Catherine had been part of a systematic arrangement, one among many adopted children brought into the Ashford family structure. The pattern became clear when the genealogist mapped it out. The Ashford family employed adopted family members in key business positions. These adopted family members held no biological claim to the company. They held no inheritance rights. They were eternally indebted to the Ashford name because they owed everything to the family that had found them. The Ashford empire, worth billions in 1996, was built on embezzled funds, shell corporations, and money laundering operations dating back to the 1960s. Gregory's father had deliberately structured the company to create a succession of found family members who could be trusted precisely because they owed everything to the Ashford name. These weren't employees. They were indentured family members. When Margaret and Gregory had their biological daughter, she represented a threat to this carefully constructed system. A true biological heir couldn't be controlled through adoption agreements or family obligation. A true biological heir would have legitimate claims to the company's structure, its finances, its operations. The real reason the baby was taken wasn't medical complications. It was business succession. Catherine had orchestrated the separation to ensure that Gregory's inheritance would be manageable, that his attention would be divided, that his grief would distract him from asking difficult questions about the family business operations. Madison had been hidden away not out of medical necessity. She had been hidden away as a tool of family control. Everything the Ashfords claimed to believe, their public image of philanthropy and family legacy, was a lie constructed to hide systemic corruption. The foundation that bore Margaret's name, the charitable works Gregory championed, the family's carefully cultivated reputation for ethical business practices, all of it had been built on a foundation of fraud. Catherine, upon discovering that Gregory had begun asking the right questions, began taking action. She moved quickly, decisively, with the certainty of someone who had operated in the shadows for decades without accountability. She attempted to discredit Madison publicly. She hired private investigators to dig into Madison's life, searching for anything that could be weaponized against her credibility. She made subtle suggestions to journalists that Madison was an opportunist attempting to extort the Ashford family. She positioned herself as a concerned family member protecting the family's reputation. She pressured the DNA testing facility to reconsider their results. She suggested that the samples might have been contaminated. She implied that Gregory was emotionally unstable and therefore unfit to make reasonable decisions. She questioned the lab's methodology with just enough technical language to sound credible. She initiated legal proceedings to have Madison declared mentally unfit for testimony. She found lawyers willing to argue that someone who had just discovered her entire identity was a fraud represented evidence of mental instability. She positioned Madison's trauma as evidence of unreliability. Most dangerously, Catherine reached out to Elena directly. She came to the small apartment where Elena and Madison lived, carrying a briefcase filled with settlement offers, money, property, security. Catherine promised Elena everything she had struggled to provide for Madison, on one condition. Elena would sign a document stating that Madison was never adopted from the Ashford family, that Madison was always her biological daughter, that the entire story Gregory had constructed was a delusion driven by a man's grief-stricken obsession. Elena's hands trembled as she held that document. She read through the terms. The money was substantial. The property was beautiful. The security was complete. Everything she had ever wanted for her daughter was being offered to her in exchange for one signature. Everything except the truth. Madison found her mother sitting at the kitchen table. The documents spread before her, tears streaming down her face. "We've lived in fear long enough," Madison said. Her voice was steady, transformed by something deeper than anger. "If we back down now, Catherine wins. She gets to keep the lie. She gets to keep stealing from people. She gets to keep destroying families." Madison took the document from her mother's hands and tore it into pieces. "We're going to finish this," Madison said. "Whatever costs." The stakes shifted in that moment. This was no longer about one missing daughter being reunited with her father. This was about systemic accountability. This was about a hidden empire built on theft and family destruction. This was about exposing the mechanisms that allowed the powerful to erase people, to rewrite history, to profit from institutional negligence. Catherine Ashford had underestimated her niece. She had assumed that a young woman raised in poverty and uncertainty would be too traumatized, too damaged, too grateful for crumbs to fight back. She had underestimated the power of someone who had finally discovered the truth about herself. Madison called Gregory that evening. "I'm ready," she said. "Whatever comes next, I'm ready. Subscribe if you believe corruption should be exposed, no matter how powerful the people protecting it." The Ashford corporate headquarters in Seattle rose like a monument to accumulated power. Gregory had chosen the venue deliberately. The annual shareholder meeting, the event where Catherine always presented the year's financial results to investors and board members. The timing was surgical. The location was strategic. This was Catherine's kingdom, and Gregory was about to burn it down in front of everyone who mattered to her. The auditorium was packed. Investors in tailored suits, journalists with recording devices and notebooks, representatives from regulatory agencies, law enforcement officers positioned strategically near exits. The audience was precisely the collection of people whose opinion mattered most to Catherine Ashford. Everyone she'd worked to impress, everyone she'd convinced of her competence, everyone she'd built her reputation with. Madison sat in the front row, her mother Elena beside her. Both women were trembling, not from fear, but from the understanding that this moment would determine everything that came next. Gregory stood at the podium surrounded by legal representatives and forensic experts. Behind them, screens displaying the evidence hung like an executioner's blade. The screens illuminated simultaneously. Side-by-side handwriting analysis appeared first. Margaret's distinctive formations beside Madison's identical script. Documents were projected next. Margaret's journal entries, their margins filled with questions that had gone unanswered for 30 years. Hospital records from Cedars-Sinai marked with redactions that couldn't hide the institutional negligence underneath. DNA results in clinical fonts that told truths that couldn't be questioned. Timeline graphics showed the exact sequence of events 30 years ago. Charlotte's appointment as trustee, the baby's transfer, the legal settlements, the sealed records. Financial transaction records scrolled across the screens, showing payments made from corporate accounts to private individuals, money flowing through channels designed to obscure its purpose. Most damning were the records revealing that the Ashford Company had been funneling money through shell corporations and international accounts for decades. Tax fraud documented in spreadsheets. Securities fraud evident in falsified filings. Money laundering that had enriched the family while impoverishing legitimate operations. And at the center of the investigation, the decision to separate Gregory from his daughter was not a medical issue. It was a business strategy. Gregory began speaking with the kind of calm that only comes from absolute certainty. He explained the discovery of Madison's existence through handwriting analysis, the impossible coincidence that had shattered 30 years of accepted narrative. He presented the DNA evidence with clinical precision. He introduced his daughter to the world. From the back of the auditorium, Catherine Ashford realized what was happening. Her face went white. She stood, intending to leave, to escape, to activate whatever contingency plan her lawyer had prepared. But security, alerted by Gregory's team in advance, blocked the exits. There was no escape from this room. There was no escape from what was about to be revealed. Gregory continued. His voice didn't waver. He presented the financial records, showing how the Ashford family business had been engaged in systematic fraud for 6 decades. He revealed that the separation of his daughter wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated. It was deliberate. It was part of succession planning designed to ensure that Gregory would be too distracted by grief to ask difficult questions about business operations. My own family, Gregory said, each word falling like a hammer, made a calculated decision to take my daughter, not to protect her, not for her welfare, to protect their business interests. Catherine attempted to speak. Her voice cut through the auditorium like a blade. She claimed Gregory was mentally unstable, pursuing a revenge fantasy constructed from grief and obsession. She suggested Madison was a fraud, a woman attempting to extort the family through an elaborate manipulation of fabricated evidence. Her lawyer tried to stop her from speaking further, but Catherine refused. She was accustomed to winning. She was accustomed to charm and manipulation, bending reality to her will. She believed she could do it now. Then Gregory played the audio recording. Catherine's voice filled the auditorium, recorded during a phone conversation with her personal attorney, captured legally by federal investigators. In that recording, Catherine discussed how to manage the Ashford situation. She outlined strategies for eliminating the leverage that Gregory's emotional instability gives him. She mentioned specific payments, specific cover-ups, specific lies that needed to be maintained. The conversation was devastating not because it was accusatory, but because it was honest. Catherine, believing she was speaking privately, had outlined the entire conspiracy with brutal clarity. She had incriminated herself with her own words, spoken in the confidence of someone who believed she would never face accountability. The auditorium erupted. Journalists were already publishing live updates to their news feeds. Photographers captured Catherine's face as understanding descended on her, the realization that she had destroyed herself. The stock market registered the shock in real time as Ashford Industries' stock began plummeting. Investors were calling their brokers. Regulatory agencies were conferring with law enforcement. Catherine's own security team, realizing the magnitude of the fraud they'd been protecting, stepped aside. Federal agents moved in methodically. Handcuffs were applied. Catherine Ashford was placed under arrest as cameras captured every moment. But before she was led away, Madison stood. The room went silent. Every eye turned toward the young woman who had been invisible for 30 years and was now impossibly, undeniably visible. "My mother raised me," Madison said. Her voice was steady, transformed by something deeper than anger. "She gave me everything she had. She broke the law because she was broken, and she was trying to fix the only way she knew how. That's not an excuse. That's context." Madison's eyes moved across the room, settling finally on Catherine, who was being escorted toward the exit by federal agents. But Catherine Ashford didn't approach my mother as a broken person seeking help. She approached her as a billionaire seeking a tool. She didn't care about me. She cared about business. She didn't care about my mother's trauma. She cared about her ability to manipulate it. Madison's voice grew stronger with each sentence, each word a declaration that she would no longer be erased, no longer be invisible, no longer be a tool in someone else's calculation. Catherine stole 30 years from me. 30 years I could have spent knowing who I was. 30 years my biological father spent searching. 30 years my adoptive mother spent living in guilt. She stole those years deliberately, strategically, and without remorse. Madison paused. The silence was absolute. But here's what Catherine didn't steal: my dignity, my ability to tell the truth, my right to be loved by multiple people without shame, my power to stand here and say I'm done being invisible. Madison looked directly at Catherine as federal agents led her toward the exit. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Justice is this moment. Justice is you losing the power to hurt anyone else. Justice is the truth finally being spoken in a room full of witnesses who matter. Gregory stepped back from the podium. He placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. In that gesture was everything that had been stolen and everything that had finally been reclaimed. Subscribe now to follow this story to its final reckoning. You won't want to miss what happens next. 6 months later, Elena's medical care was fully covered under the Ashford family's insurance policies and Gregory's personal compensation. She received specialized treatment from specialists who existed in a different universe from the struggling healthcare system that had defined her entire life. Her health improved measurably. The doctors estimated that her life expectancy had been extended by years. Years as she would live in a comfortable home paid for by Gregory, in rooms filled with light and warmth instead of the cramped apartment where she had raised Madison. Madison received full legal recognition as Madison Ashford. Her birth certificate was amended. Her name was legally changed. Her identity, which had been stolen from her at birth, was restored. She received access to a trust fund established by Margaret 30 years ago, a fund that had accumulated to over $12 million. The money was substantial, transforming her material circumstances completely. But more importantly, Madison received something money couldn't purchase: legitimate identity, family connection, and the answer to the question that had shaped her entire existence. Who am I? She was Madison Ashford. She was the daughter of Gregory and Margaret. She was also the daughter of Elena. She belonged to multiple families, multiple histories, multiple identities, and she no longer had to choose between them. Gregory established the Margaret Ashford Foundation for Missing Children. He seeded it with $100 million and committed his entire professional attention to investigating cold cases similar to Madison's. He partnered with adoption rights organizations to reform sealed record laws and prevent future institutional separations. He became obsessed with ensuring that what happened to him would never happen to another family. Gregory and Madison didn't instantly transform into the father and daughter they might have been if the past 30 years hadn't happened. There was too much time lost. There was too much identity already formed. But they became something real and valuable. Two people committed to understanding each other, building a relationship brick by brick, memory by memory, conversation by conversation. Elena was honored at the Foundation's first annual gala. She wore a dress that she would never have been able to afford in her old life. She stood on stage while Gregory presented her to the assembled guests as the woman who protected a child at great personal cost and finally had the courage to tell the truth. The applause was genuine. The recognition was real. Elena, who had spent 28 years feeling like a criminal, was finally seen as what she had always been: a mother who had made impossible choices and ultimately chosen truth. Madison visited Gregory's study one afternoon. Together, they placed Margaret's journal in a climate-controlled display case. The leather cover was preserved. The pages were protected. Margaret's handwriting, obsessive and desperate and ultimately prescient, was visible behind glass. "It's no longer a document of obsession," Gregory said softly. "It's a document of love." She refused to accept that you were gone, even when everyone told her to move on, even when it was easier to surrender. Madison placed her hand against the glass. Inside the case, Margaret's handwriting was frozen in time. A mother's refusal to accept absence, written out in loops and formations that would eventually save her daughter's life. Madison was given Charlotte Vance's jewelry. Among the pieces was a simple gold locket containing a photograph. Charlotte holding baby Madison, both of them smiling. Madison had seen that photograph in her dreams her entire life, without knowing it was real. She had carried the image in her subconscious. The yellow nursery, the woman who sang in French, the feeling of being loved, without being able to prove that any of it existed. The locket was real. The memories were real. The love had been real. Madison wears that locket every day. It hangs against her chest, a physical reminder that she had been loved by multiple people across multiple timelines, even when those loves were entangled with lies and institutional negligence. The leather journal belonging to Margaret is now displayed at the Ashford Foundation headquarters. Beside it, in an elegant frame, Madison's handwriting samples are mounted. The frame is labeled, "The Handwriting That Changed Everything." Visitors to the foundation stand before those samples and understand, viscerally, how something as simple as the formation of letters can bridge 30 years of deliberate separation. Madison left Morrison's diner, but not because she was ashamed of serving others. She left because she was offered a position as communications director for the Margaret Ashford Foundation. Her voice, the voice of someone who had lived on both sides of privilege and scarcity, became invaluable to families navigating similar separations and injustices. She understood what it meant to have been invisible. She understood what it meant to be found. Gregory found purpose beyond wealth accumulation. He found purpose in making sure that what happened to him would never happen to another family. He became a different kind of billionaire, one whose obsession had been transformed into systemic change. Elena recovered. Her health improved. She became an advocate for adoption reform and transparency in medical records, turning her complicity into redemption through service. She spent her remaining years fighting to change the systems that had allowed her story to happen. True wealth isn't measured in dollars or inheritance. True wealth is the courage to tell the truth when lies are more comfortable. It's the decision to prioritize justice over self-protection. It's the understanding that love, real, fierce, uncompromising love, can survive the biggest lies and the longest separations. Like this video if you believe families deserve truth, not secrets. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of hidden identities and impossible discoveries. Share this with someone in your life who needs to know the truth, no matter how delayed, is always worth pursuing. And comment below. Tell us about a truth you've been waiting to tell someone. Your story matters. Your voice matters.